Welcome to the Resolution Room with me, Mike Gaston. The Resolution Room is a monthly podcast on behalf of Mediation Northern Ireland and Ulster University, where we explore using mediation to resolve conflict. In this episode, the third in the series, it's on workplace conflict. And on this edition, we'll talk about the costs of conflict in the workplace. We'll explore some of the ways of reducing the potential for conflict and conflict escalation at work. And we'll look at how mediation can help resolve conflicts at work. To help us do that, I'm joined by Mark McAllister, Chief Executive of the Labour Relations Agency, and John Conaghan, Interim Managing Director at Mediation Northern Ireland. Mark and John, you're both very welcome to the Resolution Room. We'll turn to Mark first. Mark, your organisation, the Labour Relations Agency, has done some research on the costs of workplace conflict. So just how serious is the problem here?
It's a very significant problem with regard to the extent of workplace conflict and how it can manifest itself and end up in relationships being fundamentally destroyed and ultimately with individuals either litigating against their employer and leaving the organisation. So the importance of mediation from our perspective is about saving the fabric of that work relationship at an early juncture. But invariably, by the time we're approached, the working relationship has been fundamentally destroyed.
And that must be one of the issues for you, John, in mediation terms, because if the relationship is totally destroyed, it's very, very hard to work on that.
Exactly. I think one of the biggest problems is you find a lot of organisations don't invest early enough in early resolution conflict solutions. As Mark pointed out, by the time it usually ends up with the LRA or in terms of some sort of formal grievance or a process, it's incredibly costly for the organisation, but not even just in monetary terms. It has such an impact on the culture of the organisation and the general sense of, people in that organisation feeling valued or listened to or engaged and supported. So from our perspective as Mediation and I, we're very supportive of that strategy in organisations to try and invest and get a lot of work done early, especially with line management, to make sure that they're able to spot and deal with issues around conflict and have those skills that enable them to support their staff much better.
So turning back to Mark, what I'm hearing is there are a couple of costs, Mark. There is the human dynamic cost. There's the loss of faith. There's a loss of belief that this is a workplace where I can happily work. But there's also the economic cost, which is massive.
Close to, when we did our research, it was close to £1 billion a year, 851 million. And that involves costs in terms of time taken to, as John talked about taking formal grievances right through to the litigation. So you can look at it in pure financial terms, but the human cost and the relationship cost, you have to look at all of those things.
Okay, and that's very, very important that we do that. Let's just take an example here. At the end of the day, we're talking in broad terms about conflict in the workplace. But let's just look at some of the specifics. One of the best cures is prevention. Mm-hmm. So what can organisations do, John, to make their workplace a less conflict-prone environment?
Well, in a past life, an area I'm still very passionate in is talking about creating cultures of psychological safety in the workplace. And that really is very much about a top-down led culture where the senior people in the organisation talk very openly and honestly about their own challenges, difficulties, experiences, etc., encouraging staff to be open and honest. So many organisations, they're policy-driven. It's all about, what the policy and the procedure says. But for me, it is much more about having the skills to engage in good conversations with staff, building relationships. There's some great examples of local employers here. And again, I've highlighted in some of the research, all the research that the LRA have done, where, staff who feel engaged, valued, listened to and supported. There is no coincidence that those organisations are incredibly successful. So it is really about an organisation deciding that it wants to have a very specific focus and, strategies around finance and business objectives and people, etc. You need to be very open and honest and say, we want a culture where people feel valued and listened to and supported here. And then they have to back that up. They have to back that up with actions. So senior management, as I say again, one of the biggest challenges often is, when issues arise, how comfortable the staff feel to put their hand up and talk about issues and mistakes? Is that dealt in a punishment approach, or is it looking at learning and rectifying and trying to establish a culture whereby people feel able to speak up openly and honestly about challenges and issues? So I think that's really, there's a challenge for a lot of organisations here to kind of, I suppose, put their money, where their mouth is in terms of actually stepping up and investing in people's skills within their organisation.
So it's very much about creating the right environment, not necessarily in terms of the space, but in terms of the listening capacity of the organisation. Mark, one of the things I noticed was that the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development recently found that reports of workplace conflict had dropped from 30% of the surveyed workforce in 2019 to 25% in 2024. Now, before we get all excited, one of the elements in that they postulated was that it's to do with the fact that people were working from home. Mm. So is some of this about having your own space in the workplace?
I think the whole working from home and the hybrid working dynamic has changed the everything to do with the workplace and relationships and that distance and the impact that distance has on conflict. I mean, John's absolutely right in the sense that the key to all of this is not simply the message coming from top down in the organisation, but it's the ability for line managers and frontline supervisors to spot the warning signs early and have those difficult conversations with people without feeling the need to be completely procedurally driven. And unfortunately, many organisations look to the comfort blanket of a procedure to make sure they've done everything correct without looking at the impact on the relationship. So a lot of line managers are uncomfortable with, flying without a safety net, and having the conversations with people about it. And it's made even more difficult if that conversation's done remotely over a Teams meeting or whatever it happens to be. So that's completely changed the dynamic. And, it's probably too early in the day to say for a long term what the impact has been on conflict levels in the organisation with people working from home. It's early days, but it definitely has changed the dynamic.
What I'm hearing there is that there's a fear of litigation, there's a fear of risk to the organisation, and there's maybe not enough focus on the promotion of good behaviours, of good listening habits, and of fixing the problem rather than punishing people in a line management way.
Absolutely, and I think line managers need to be given those mediation type skills to be able to listen and to recognise the warning signs and talk people through. And difficulty is many people are promoted in an organisation because they're good at the job they're doing, not because they're a good line manager or a good listener or a good facilitator or a good, have the inherent mediation skills. And the lack of value placed on that in an organisation speaks volumes about the culture of that organisation.
I mean, one of the tragedies in life is that as soon as you become really good at the job, doing something functional, you're promoted to management, which you're not necessarily good at. John, you must come across that in your working life all the time.
Mike, a lot. And what Mark says is absolutely right, especially when we have such a heavily dominant public sector employment roles here in the north as well, where again, people due to experience, longevity in the role, qualifications are promoted, but there is a lack then of investment in the people skills, the leadership skills, the softer skills we talk about, that ability to be able to have that insight. I mean, going back to the point you were saying about hybrid working, Mike, I think one of the interesting things about hybrid working and the pandemic was it gave people an insight into their colleagues' lives. People were literally in their bedrooms, their kitchens, their living rooms. The kids were walking in and out. And suddenly people did begin to see that this isn't just a person who comes in 9 to 5 or whatever, 8 to 4, whatever it might be. These are people who have lives. And I do feel it led to an element of a bit more engagement at least, and it kind of did open the doors into, life outside of work. But I fear that we're slipping back. I think we've lost a lot of what people thought was some of the good elements, I think, of that engagement. But yes, without a doubt, there's a huge challenge in that, the ability of organisations to invest and think about the whole person.
We've touched on this a little, Mark, but let's just look at it in a bit more detail. We've talked about what organisations can do to support conflict prevention and early conflict resolution. Can we kind of string that out a wee bit and look at the detail of what that would look like?
Well, for example, the Labour Relations Agency, we do a course called the Line Manager Certificate, which is primarily focused on the skill set regarding things like how to handle discipline and grievance issues, but in an informal way, in a way that stops it necessarily escalating. And that's about having the skills to be able to, as I said, recognise the warning signs when the fabric of a working relationship is starting to tear at the seams, to get in early and move away from the culture of, many organisations we would work with would say, well, you need to put that in writing. And the minute that somebody puts something in writing, you are locked into a formal procedure. Mm-hmm. And then it's about the tick box of, people just saying, oh, well, I've done this, I've done that and done that. And the difficulty when line managers haven't been trained, John talked about, sometimes from a people perspective, people are promoted, to a level of incompetence regarding people management skills. And that's through no fault of their own. It's just because it's not prioritised in the organisation. So there is a lot about the culture and the training around this issue to see the value of it. And unfortunately, you have to sometimes put it into pounds, shillings and pence to say, this is the cost of not doing this, because that's the only thing that speaks to many organisations. And John's right in the sense that the pandemic is, post-pandemic, people have a new perspective on work and life and their work-life balance and what work means to them. And the lines between what would have been maybe a social issue have now become blurred, because 10 years ago, you wouldn't necessarily say that menopause was a workplace issue. Menopause is now a workplace issue. So you have lots of these social issues that have bled in to the workplace, and now people's expectations of employers are higher in terms of what they expect from the employer, and the employer has to manage that. Especially when there are issues around recruitment and retention, and people say, "Well, look, if it doesn't work for me, I leave." People will vote with their feet,
and that's hard for the workplace. Harder now than it was pre-pandemic.
Absolutely.
Okay, John, one of the things that's occurring to me in this is that in mediation terms, if we've entered procedures, if we started procedures, we have almost shut the door on mediation. Would that be a view you would have?
To a large extent. It's incredibly difficult then, I think, to kind of bring things back and often resolve because, again, as Mark says, maybe you're so far down the line in a formal process, people become very entrenched, and it becomes very difficult then to kind of find an area of common agreement on an area where you can break through to kind of move things forward. So again, while mediation is important, I think the point at which mediation comes into play is hugely important as well. An organisation shouldn't see it as a kind of we'll just default to mediation if there's a conflict. It should be that situation of, okay, have we got the right culture that enables difficult situations to be dealt with effectively? And if we need mediation, it should be brought in much earlier. It should be than it is. Typically, again, and Mark will see it a lot within the LRA, the difficult positions have been really so well established that it becomes very, very difficult. And again, going back to the point we made, it's not just, yes, of course, there's an economic cost in time, lost productivity, absenteeism, all of those things. But the overall impact it has rippling across the whole organisation when people see colleagues and difficulty or relationships breaking down and it not being effectively managed and dealt with within the organisation, people will look and go, well, what if that ends up being me? Mm-hmm. So do I want to be in this organisation? And again, Mark is right. When I talk to senior leaders across the business sector here over the last number of years, recruitment and retention are the two key priorities for them because they're all competing, especially in the burgeoning and growing private sector we have here, all trying to get from the same pool to recruit people in. So they want to recruit and they want to keep people. So again, good organisations, they're focusing a lot on the culture of the organisation. Come and work for us because this is how we will look after you, engage with you and work with you. So that's a very important factor now in terms of recruitment.
Turning back to Mark, one of the things that I'm hearing here is that the first port of call tends to be the line manager, but is the line manager necessarily the only person who can spot a conflict that is bubbling under the surface?
Well, absolutely not. I mean, many organisations, it could be a colleague, it could be a harassment contact officer, it could be, a line manager from a different department. There's no hard and fast rule in that regard. I think the key issue is how it's handled. And when, difficulty is when you have a focus on informality, there aren't any rules necessarily, or there aren't any parameters or frameworks that you work within. So if somebody says something to someone in an informal context who isn't their line manager, does that person say, well, you need to take that up with your line manager? So there is this, that you bob and weave between procedural correctness and trying to resolve it early. And I don't think organisations give enough thought to informal dispute resolution, because the minute that they commit pen to paper, the informal becomes formal, and you're into this sort of, this negative cycle. I mean, if you think about the whole notion of alternative dispute resolution and why tribunals were set up in the early days in the first place, it was 3 cornerstone principles: low cost, informal, and high speed. They've gone. The same ethos applies in the workplace. You'd be trying to get this sort of, but you need to instill and enable people to say, if this happens, this is what you should do.
And the costs are important. The climate is important. But I was hearing John saying that the element of how it affects the individual and how it affects colleagues across the board, because you see a colleague in stress, colleague off work because of stress. That's a cost not just to the individual, not just to the organisation for that individual's input into the work. It's actually across the board. Everyone sees it. Everyone's affected by it. So here's the question. What do organisations need to do to handle the early stages of conflict between colleagues?
Well, again, it comes back to, I think, that point we've talked about in terms of, yes, the line manager and leadership roles are hugely important. And I think timing and investing with those individuals to have the confidence. This is a courage thing. This is a confidence and a courage thing often with senior leaders to kind of, bring in that element of engagement with staff, in terms of how best do we want to operate as an organisation. Because it's the same with the line manager. Well, the line manager shouldn't be, it's my way or the highway. It should be about how do we engage the team to have the right outcome. What's the vision of our organisation? What's our mission? How best are we going to achieve this? And if teams and individuals within teams feel, as I say, engaged and valued and listened to, and feel that they're invested in their organisation, well, it's no surprise to say that those organisations who do that tend to be the most successful, tend to have less of a turnover, tend to have great customer advocacy scores, because their team feel that they're invested in delivering good quality services for their customers. So giving responsibility, this is a big challenge for organisations, but giving responsibility to your teams and your individuals to create and set those kind of behaviour parameters. How do we expect each other to behave? So the line manager role should become much more of a facilitator than necessarily directing. It should be very much around, what are we looking to achieve as a team? How best are we going to do it? Is there a point this year where it might impact on you, Mike, and you mightn't be able to give as much? Or Mark, what do I need to do for you to help you get through that so that it's a minimal impact on the team? So a lot of it is about language, narrative, the type of discussions that take place. And those are not traditionally part of leadership training, if you like, in terms of senior roles.
And I mean, we can say organisationally we care about you, but actually we have to demonstrate that.
Absolutely.
We don't demonstrate it. We're honestly wasting our time. So in that context, how important might it be to think about, to consider training people in conflict awareness, in mediation awareness, in mediative behaviours, but certainly primarily in conflict awareness.
Yeah, and that's something we do in mediation. And we can come into organisations and we can, of course, deliver mediation in terms of as an intervention. But a big part of the work that we do is exactly that. It's working with organisations and staff within organisations to understand how best do you have what we talk about courageous conversations. Used to be challenging and difficult conversations. Now it's kind of how do we have the courageous conversations? But exactly that is how do we make sure that we're able to see and identify what might be the red flags that can cause difficult challenges, and when's the best time to come in and have those conversations? Because you can have those conversations in a very supportive way, still within the context of work priorities, things that need to be done. But I think that language I go back to of managers being able to say to people, what can I do for you? What do you need from me? How can we, moving things forward, helping to train organisations and staff and how to have those types of conversations is very important.
So we're talking there about mediation awareness, about having an awareness across the organisation, not just about mediation, but about conflict awareness, to enable people to recognise when there's a conflict brewing and to be able to have those courageous conversations. But how important might it be to train supervisors, to train line managers in mediation skills so that they can work with the early signs of conflict?
I think that's essential. I think that's where you're at the coal face. That's where the relationship will often break down early. So the early intervention will be spotted by the line manager. And if the line manager is given the necessary skills, they don't have to be qualified mediators, but to have mediation skills, the listening skills and the reframing skills and the questioning skills and all of the sort of core component parts of mediation, if they are given to your line managers, and it's supported by the organisation from the top, because the tone is set from the top, the culture is set from the top. We talk about weaving a golden thread of alternative dispute resolution through the organisation. That's not simply just with regard to policies, but it has to be in practice as well. So you have to make sure it's not simply just putting somebody on a training course and say, there you go. Very often we find that there's a very perfunctory approach to this. And what happens is the organisation insert a mediation clause into their grievance procedure, or they'll say this is what the steps that you have to take. And the difficulty is it almost creates an abdication culture where mediation is seen as the panacea, the silver bullet to resolve all workplace ills. And that's wrong as well. You need to make sure that you live and breathe these cultures. And this frontline supervisors are where it happens. There's no point in having it locked in a policy document in a drawer somewhere, or it comes out at the State of the Nation address from the chief executive. It's your frontline supervisors who are going to make the difference.
Of course, but the problem too is that in talking to my line manager, I may not necessarily be prepared to admit that I'm in a conflict situation. I may rather not talk to that person about what's going on for fear it might affect my bonuses or my future development in the workplace.
Yeah, and I mean, again, each organisation will have different provisions. Some people will talk to a colleague, some will talk to a harassment contact officer, some will, there are different ways. People will know themselves, but it's about having the emotional intelligence to recognise when someone's under stress because a relationship is breaking down. We have a saying in the Labour Relations Agency, people don't leave jobs, people leave people. And this is the reality, and we see it. And people leave people because the problem hasn't been addressed early enough at the appropriate level.
I think for me, one of the issues is how organisations manage to separate processing the early stages of conflict from line management and from HR discussions, because people who are risk averse will immediately go procedure. But we know that once we go into procedure, we've locked the track ready for the conflict. So how do we enable organisations, or how do organisations enable themselves to separate processing the early stages of conflict from that cycle?
I think John alluded to it earlier on. This is a cultural piece in the organisation where people feel comfortable having those courageous conversations with someone and not waiting until someone makes a formal complaint. If you witness it, if you see behaviour that reasonably should be called out, if you were an innocent bystander looking on the outside looking in and say that's wrong, that behaviour needs to be called out. I mean, it pertains to everything. Ending violence against women and girls is a massive issue here. Mm-hmm. I mean, if a line manager saw behaviour that was bordering on misogynistic in the workplace, they should have the courageous conversation to call that out without having to say, what does the policy say?
Yeah. No, absolutely, 100%. If you see something that's totally wrong, you have to call it. You have to call it right away. Mm-hmm. How useful might it be to instill alternative dispute resolution as part of the policy structure of organisations? Now, you've said it's all very well to have a policy and lock it in a drawer, but if it's a stated policy, it becomes fairly fundamental to the way the organisation operates.
It does, and it has to be given a chance to bed in and be lived and be seen to be effective, not simply be a policy document that, as I said, is dusted off. People need to see this in practice, so that relationships are resolved. As John said earlier on, when people recognise that a relationship is being destroyed and it's going down the tubes and nothing seems to be done, it has a ripple effect. It infects the rest of the organisation. So it's incumbent upon a line manager to recognise that and stop the infection, if you like, at its course. But people need to be able to be given the space to do that and the support from the senior managers to say, get in there and resolve that. It's easier said than done. Great, you need a great degree of assertiveness and courage to do it. But that's a cultural piece.
And the problem is that the accountants at the top of the organisation are saying, look, this is costing us money. It's not leading to productivity. What are we doing here? Yeah. How do you combat that?
I mean, what you could say is if the relationship really does go down the tubes and you go to the real costs will be when you're hiring barristers and you're going to litigation, and then you will see it. And the difficulty then is the relationship is viewed through the lens of an economic decision. So if somebody's gone to a tribunal and you're going to settle or whatever it happens to be, that's where the accountants maybe come into their own. But you need accountants to look at the real value. You often hear the expression, they know the cost of everything, but the value of nothing. It's the value of the working relationship you have to be able to grasp.
The value of the working relationship, but also if you are facing a potential bill of 2 million plus barrister costs, you are going to have to focus on that because that becomes a harsh business reality.
Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. And if you're litigating and you're in front of the tribunal, you're in a public domain. The reputational risk associated with the organisation as well as being deemed to be a bad employer, you can't put a cost on that.
Before we move on to wrap up, what I'd like to do is just a quick summary to see that we've captured all the points, because I think that's very, very important. So we've started with prevention's better than cure. We've started with organisations need to create a climate where conflict is recognised and named fairly early. We need to have some form of conflict awareness in the workplace. We have to have some form maybe of mediation skills training in the workplace, if it's all possible, if that's deemed to be appropriate. And really, we have to enable organisations not just to say, I care about you as an employee, but actually demonstrate that. What else are we missing in this pie?
I think that summarises that encapsulates it really, really well. We, both Mediation Northern Ireland and the Labour Relations Agency have been saying this for years. The difficulty is it's trying to get that message through. Some organisations are really good. You have some great case studies. In the public sector, some of these things are well embedded. But as John says, you have a burgeoning private sector economy. Northern Ireland's made up primarily of SMEs. SMEs are in survival mode. Mm-hmm. They, in terms of their list of priorities, perhaps training line managers and mediation skills is, near the bottom of the list. And that's really unfortunate because it's only when a problem occurs that they think about it after the event. So
Can we do this on a pure economic cost basis? Because we know how much, and we're talking billions, we know how much conflict in the workplace and conflict resolution is costing our businesses and our working environments. Can we do it on just say to the accountants at the top of the organisation, look, if you don't do this, next year you will lose so many hundreds, thousands or millions of pounds. Can we do it that way?
You could walk into the organisation and show them a balance sheet with a massive minus beside it, and that might shock the accountants into action.
Well, maybe it takes shock sometimes. Now, I suppose one of the things that I'd like to look at finally, and it's something, Mark, that you're keen on talking about too, which is, should we also be looking to create a Northern Ireland Code of Governance and Regulation for mediation or alternative dispute resolution?
I think so. There's a lot of good work goes on in mediation in a variety of contexts, be it commercial or family or whatever. But and workplace mediation is really, really important. What it probably lacks is what I would call a governance architecture around it. There's not a governance architecture around workplace mediation that addresses things like, the core skills, the training, the quality assurance, all of the things that you'd be able to say from a customer service perspective, this is the assurances we can give you. I'm not saying it's unregulated and it's the Wild West, but it lacks the discipline of governance architecture. I'd like to see that. We don't have a civil mediation council in Northern Ireland. So the difficulty is there's nothing to stop individuals, setting themselves up as a mediator and trying to do that. And the harm that could do is very significant.
100%. Thanks, Mark. John?
I totally agree with what Mark is saying. I think we should also approach this from a way in which it will assist and help organisations that are looking to bring in the services we've talked about, whether it's how do I build more positive behaviours in the organisation, how do I manage conflict more effectively, if I need mediation, how can I be assured that I will be able to have well-qualified mediators coming in who know the structure, who know how to bring the best possible intervention. So we need to come with this from a point of view of having that governance architecture, as Mark has talked about, because it will help everyone. It'll help us as service providers, helps the likes of the LRA, but ultimately will help organisations who are seeking for the best possible help. Where can they get it from, and how can they be confident that the right people are coming in to work with them?
Thanks, John. On that note, that brings us to the end of this edition of the Resolution Room on Workplace Conflict. Many thanks to Mark McAllister, Chief Executive of the Labour Relations Agency. Many thanks to John Conaghan, Interim Managing Director at Mediation Northern Ireland. If you'd like to find out more about workplace mediation, or if you'd like to find out more about mediation awareness or mediation skills training, or if there's a conflict in your workplace that you'd like to have resolved, contact Mediation Northern Ireland at www.mediationnorthernireland.org. Thanks for listening. We look forward to your company in the Resolution Room for the next edition of this podcast.